I'm Jan Hewley, the President and CEO of the Marines Memorial, and it's my honor to welcome you to tonight. I'm really excited tonight about tonight's show. It's 101 years ago today, the first convoy of the American Expeditionary Forces troops landed in France. And then 1 year after that, the Marines were in the thick of it, making history and establishing their place in national security in the 20th and probably the 21st century. So that's what we're going to hear about tonight. I'm obliged to tell you that the Marines Memorial Association is a 501c19, a veterans nonprofit, and we're supported by a 501c3, a nonprofit and with those, being a nonprofit doesn't mean we don't need to make a little money in this operation. So tonight's presentation is being sponsored by Synchrony Financial. A big round of applause and thank Synchrony for that. As a 501c19, and as General Myatt taught me, our mission is to commemorate, educate, and serve. Tonight we're going to commemorate what Marines did. We're going to educate all of us with a great performance, I think, a great presentation. We've got a narrator that you're gonna all probably recognize, Mike Cerre. Mike was a Notre Dame graduate. What's the matter, Mike? You couldn't go to Cal? Okay, so you took second best. He started out before his 30 years in the industry of journalism and communications. He started out as a Marine officer in Vietnam, where he served a tour. Prior to his 30 years, he's done broadcast journalism, and he's been an international guy throughout his entire career. He's been a correspondent for ABC News, for Good Morning America. He's been a news anchor in San Francisco, so many of you locals might recognize him from there. And he's been a co-host of PM Magazine. He's been a broadcast featured nationally and internationally, and he was embedded in Afghanistan as a correspondent. He gives guest lectures to universities. I noticed you did get at least a lecture at Cal. They let you in once. See me afterwards. I'll see if I can get you in again. He talks to forums, foundations, and councils throughout. He has many awards, to include a Peabody. I had a teacher by that name one time. I don't know if that's after her, but a Peabody and an Emmy for international reporting and documentary production. And he's currently with PBS NewsHour. Mike Cerre.
Some very important history that I missed 50 years ago when I first heard about Belleau Wood at Quantico, Virginia, when I started my Marine Corps training. Now, I'm going to blame it on that Quonset hut that was probably 110 degrees inside with an equal amount of humidity as they were teaching us our Marine Corps history. And I must admit, I didn't get all of it. So tonight, and the preparation for tonight, I'm catching up on what I missed 50 years ago. And actually, it finally came to roost when I was embedded in Iraq, and I saw the young Marines consistently refer to each other as dogs, devil dogs. And I realized how important this was to anyone who served in the Marine Corps. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Annette Amerman with us, who's really going to set us straight on all the nuances, the history, and the context of Belleau Wood, which makes it so important not only for what happened with World War I, but the coming of age of the Marine Corps. This was a seminal moment for the Marine Corps. And so that's why it's very important. Annette is the head of the Historical Reference Branch at the Marine Corps History Division. Probably wrote that same little pamphlet I was supposed to learn 50 years ago. She serves as a serious historian for the History Division's World War I Centennial Commemorative Publications. She joined the division in 1995 as an intern, fresh out of Shenandoah University. She's earned her master's degree in history at George Mason University. In addition to her normal duties, she's edited and updated a reprint of Edwin McClellan's the United States in World War I, 2015. And she's compiled and wrote the United States Marines in the First World War, anthology, selected by bibliography, and annotated order of battle. That was in 2016. And as well as the Marines have landed, 80 years of the Marine Corps landings, 1935 to 2015. She has published numerous articles in Leatherneck, Marine Corps Gazette, and other magazines. And as I can see, she's a real rock star because no less than 3 of you fellow Marines have come and thanked her for all of her help in researching your former units and presented her with challenge coins. And we know she really is a rock star when it comes to the history of the Marine Corps. Among other things tonight, she will debunk and clarify 3 of the greatest myths surrounding Belleau Wood, which will no doubt delight our Army, Air Force, Navy, and Coast Guard attendees tonight.
Mostly the Army.
Mostly the Army. So we're going to give a little bit of equal time there. But Annette, welcome to San Francisco. Welcome to the Marines Memorial
Well,
Club.
thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, General Hewley. Thank you, General Myatt, and the rest of the folks coming, especially Colonel Mahar and John Lockey and Doug Gooden, who I've helped over the years. And thank you for coming up and seeing me. It's a pleasure to be here. What a beautiful building this is. It is honestly quite the memorial to the Marines, and what much better fitting building. I couldn't think of one.
Annette,
I'll try not to be.
Annette, bring us up to speed on where Paul Cox, a couple others mentioned as we came here. I didn't really know that much about World War I, and I don't think many of us do, as much as the other wars. So kind of bring us up to speed and how important World War I was, not only for the country, but for the Marine Corps. Where were we as a military force at that time?
Well, I've done up a couple slides, so if we go through to help illustrate, because me dancing on the stage is not fun, nobody wants to see that. But let's just give you a little perspective on the Marine Corps when 1914 takes off, when the war takes off in Europe. The Corps is relegated to ship's duty, barracks duty, garrison duty, and a little bit of expeditionary duty and constabulary duty. It is less than 11,000 Marines in 1914. And as you can see, it ramps up quickly to go into the war. And it is dramatic, the increase that happens overnight. The Major General George Barnett, who's the Commandant of the Marine Corps, actually can kind of see that this is coming. Yes, the Americans don't want to go into the war, but Barnett can see it coming. So he starts to pull those Marines back from places like China, Philippines, Nicaragua, and things like that, to have them ready for when it's necessary. The Corps is very tiny, but in the grand scheme of things, it is the only force of American soldiers or military that have actually any combat experience going into the war. Yes, the Army has a little bit from Philippines and such, but the Marines are the only ones of any number that actually have combat trained forces to go into World War I.
And despite that, the Army wanted to leave the Marines behind in garrison duty.
They did. They did not want them.
Was that just professional jealousy, or was there another underlying reason why they were lobbying with the War Department, leave the Marines at home?
I think mostly it was simply they didn't understand what they were. Soldiers of the sea. Well, that just sounds confusing to Army. You're not infantry, but you are. But you're not sailors, but you kind of are. I don't think they understood what the Marine Corps was and its capabilities.
How much did that have to do with kind of the reputation of the old Corps Marines as being somewhat mercenary ruffians,
it attracted its sense of
unorthodox fighters and whatever. Was that kind of catching up with the Marine Corps?
A little bit, but at the time, yes, the Marine Corps was a place where you could go up and down the ranks very easily for a variety of things. It attracted characters, to say the least. Those who would bend their elbow and then get busted the next night for being over leave. But who would then go on to prove that that's just one aspect of me. I can go and fight this war and take care of business if need to. Matter of fact, there were 2 recruiters in St. Louis we talked about earlier, one was a lieutenant and one was a first sergeant, and they both enlisted right about the turn of the century and had gone up the ranks, gone down the ranks, and one had actually deserted, came back into the Marine Corps, served his time. Now he's a first sergeant. St. Louis turned out to be the city with the most the ability to recruit the most, more so than New York City and Cleveland combined in 1918. So apparently they knew what they were doing.
So when Pershing told the War Department, we're going to leave the Marines behind, what did the Marines decide to do then?
Well, that's the funny part. The Army has its own U.S. Army transport ships. You've probably heard of the Sherman and the Grant. And the Army said, no, we can't really send you over. We don't have the ships. We're sending our own forces over. Then the Marine Corps said, okay, we'll figure it out, and went around and started rounding up their own ability to send Marines over, finding their own
Navy
ships.
comrades help us out?
A little bit, they did.
Did they have a few ships?
They had to do a little drug dealing with them, but they did. They actually got the Navy to send them over, so.
The other thing that's quite amazing is the makeup of those initial troops. I mean, the goal was to make a 1 million-man army, so there was a really challenging recruiting mission, but the Marines went over the top and ended up getting probably one of the most selective cadres of Marines we've ever had.
It certainly did. As a matter of fact, so the 5th Regiment, when it's formed, is formed from a lot of those veterans that had been pulled from those far-flung places. And because they were able to do that, the regiment goes over in 3 weeks. I don't know that you could do that today if you take away the ability to fly these people these places. If you take that ability away, could you send a whole regiment in 3 weeks? The Army couldn't do it then. So 5th Regiment heads over, and then the 6th Regiment takes a little bit longer to form. But this is really kind of unique. What they've done now is pulled in a lot of college men. Matter of fact, the University of Minnesota gave up 300 of its own students in mass. They enlisted all in once, and they ended up in the 6th Regiment in France. We got a lot of Ivy League officers, which is really surprising. We got a lot of the cream of the crop and a lot of the best of the families. They came into the Marine Corps. Lloyd Williams is a very prominent Marine out of Berryville, Virginia. His family had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, he joined the Marine Corps after having been through VPI, which is now Virginia Tech. And, it is amazing that they were able to pull so many people. They wanted to come to the Marine Corps, whether it was because they would have had to wait to go into the Army to get their commission or their position, or that they'd heard stories about the first to fight and the recruiters doing so well to get that word out. They attracted the best of the best. They wanted to be a Marine. Same as today.
As surprising as the statistic is of going from 10,000 to 50,000 to gear up for the war, is that 60% of them were college graduates.
Yep, across the board.
I don't think the Marine Corps has ever had that kind of
It was, I think, between the fervor of wanting to get into the war and being able to go into the best service in their mind, I think the Marine Corps really got the cream of the crop.
Okay. Now, spring of they start heading over in 1917. Take us now to the spring of 1918. Where are we in the war, and why is it so critical that the Americans get there and get in the game?
I want to show you where the 4th Brigade is within the AEF. So all that manpower, and the Marine Corps is relegated to this one little piece, the combat forces. Now, there is another brigade, and we'll talk about that later. That's the 5th Brigade, but it's relegated way over there on the far right to service of supply. It does not see combat. We'll get to that. So, spring of 1918. Russia drops out of the war in March, and that allows the Germans to pull 50 combat experienced divisions off the Eastern Front and bring them to bear on the Western Front. The French and the English have been fighting for 4 years. They're worn down. And they don't think the Americans are ready yet. They've been there for about a year, but they're not ready yet in their mind. And they want to punch through to Paris in one big drive before the Americans can get online and get in there. Unfortunately, we did. We stayed. We were going to fight. And we gave it back to them and shoved them right back. And this is where Belleau Wood is. You see it down in the right-hand corner at the bottom there. That's Chateau Thierry. That is the major city nearest Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood is like 10 miles outside of that. It's a tiny little hunting preserve.
Now, General Pershing, with the backing of Woodrow Wilson, demanded, and it was allowed, to keep the American units together intact rather than just put them in as replacements for the French and the British. Couldn't the Marine Corps do the same thing? The Marine Corps, they had to be integrated in with the Army rather than be standalone.
That was the drug deal that the Marine Corps made. It said, look, we're going to go. We can't do it alone. We have to go with the Army. Fine, so be it. If we can stay together as a brigade, then they can fight. Pershing was adamant, we're not going to amalgamate our forces, because what the British wanted to do and the French, they wanted to pull us apart by individuals and conscript them into their country's army. And Wilson and Pershing said they wanted no part of that. So we were able to keep our American Army together, and then the Marines were just part of that. They kept them together as well. But that was the deal that had been made. You're going to be part of the Army, you're going to wear Army uniforms, you're going to subscribe to Army TONEs.
Okay. So they get over there, they have helmets, some of them borrowed from the British.
They do.
They're getting the artillery from the French. They didn't have any of their own equipment. They were really understaffed and undergeared up for that fight that they were going into.
Certainly, certainly.
So how did Pershing decide to use them in the first place? I mean, if he was saying, okay, I can't just place them in with the French and the British, what was he going to do with them?
We had no choice. This is where the Germans forced the hand. So the first and second divisions are already there. They're fully up and round. They're ready to go. When the Germans punch through, these guys the second division is the closest that can get in there. And he takes that second division and shoves it towards Chateau Thierry to stop that German advance, because this is the closest point they're getting to Paris. And it's Belleau Wood where the Marines are part. So think of the Belleau Wood as a part of the Chateau Thierry campaign. It's a larger campaign, second division, and the Marines are a part of that. And the Marines, and we're talking about the Belleau Wood portion of that. You still have the 3rd Brigade, which is the 9th and 23rd Infantries. You've got bits and pieces of other units. With the Marines are the 2nd Engineers, and they're with them toe-to-toe through the whole thing.
And throughout all this, where is the legendary Smedley Butler?
Butler doesn't even actually arrive in France until the fall of 1918, much to his chagrin.
And where'd they put him?
They put him in the Service of Supply, where he did his best work.
Take a Medal of Honor winner? Put him in the supply.
He fought like the Dickens to get into combat, and they said, stay.
So as they head to Chateau Thierry and they head for Belleau Wood, what are the Marines seeing as they're heading up to that line?
Yeah, so what they're seeing are a lot of French civilians coming back and French military coming back. And one of the quotes that you're going to hear is, "Retreat hell, we just got here." So we see actually that as the Marines are going forward, the saying is that Captain Lloyd Williams of Berryville, Virginia, encounters a French major who says, "C'est fini, go back, it's done, you need to leave." And his quote to the major was, "Retreat hell, we just got here." There are some questions as to whether he said it or if somebody else said it. So Fritz Wise is his actual commanding officer, his battalion commanding officer. Lloyd Williams, quite the dashing figure. Everybody mentioned Marine, very tall, ramrod straight, handsome, that lovely mustache. The question is, was it Wise who said it, or was it Lloyd Williams? And in 1921, the former regimental commander, Logan Phelan, jumps into it and says, "Hey, I've got this piece of paper. This is the actual message that Williams sent back to Wise." And he basically says, the French gave him an order to retreat, and I basically countermanded that and said, "Don't shorten your artillery. We're going to be moving in to fill the gap." It is said that he writes this because he may have offended the French major by saying, "Retreat hell, we just got here." And he wanted it on the record that this is what he said, although there are some questions. Now, the interesting part of this is that Phelan actually says, you do realize that Wise had been in the Marine Corps 20 years more than Williams, so I think he knew more about cussing than Williams did.
And who would be more diplomatic?
And who would be more diplomatic, yeah. So the question is whether either one of them said it. Actually, I suspect that both of them said it in their own variation, as did many people when they heard, they want us to go back, they want us to retreat, we just got here, the hell with that, we're going to stay and fight. And this is across the broad spectrum of the Marine Corps and the Americans themselves. They have the idea, look, we're here to do a business, we're going to get it done. You're not sending us home before we've had a chance to get into it.
And there was no question they were entering the fight of their lives.
They were.
Belleau Wood.
They were.
What was the situation at Belleau Wood when they got there?
Oh, the Germans have been there for a long time. So in the wood itself, you have the Germans and their Maxim machine guns. They're dug in. Everything is zeroed in. To get to them, you have to cross open wheat fields. Now, everybody talks about the wheat field at Belleau Wood, but it is multiple wheat fields. You have clumps of trees in various bits and bobs, and there are Germans in those places, and you have to get to them to get them out. It's not a pleasant thing. You go from cover, open wheat field, to the wood. Okay, sounds like an easy job, except that the Germans are now firing their machine guns at you. You cannot run across the wheat field. Why? We have this thing called a rolling barrage. This is artillery that goes out in front of you and slowly progresses in front of you. If you run, you will run into your own artillery. You cannot outrun it. So you just have to cross the wheat field with your rifle and hope to get across.
So as the Marines are there, and you read the accounts where they could see the bark ripping off the trees, they could see the heads of the wheat stalks getting nipped off there on their bellies, and then a 5'6", 135-pound, 40-year-old gunny fires them up.
He does. He does what a gunny is supposed to do with his junior Marines. He takes the order from the CO and says, engage. Except that he says, come on, you sons of bitches, you want to live forever? And he drags them out. And that's Dan Daly. He's definitely the man. If he says that to me, I'm going to follow him wherever he goes.
When the gunny says, if the gunny ain't happy, nobody's
There's
gonna be
nobody happy, yeah.
So, but now there's a little bit of debate over to what he really said. So tell us what we think he said and what Daly later said he said.
Well, so Daly never actually comes out and talks about his quote, with one exception. He hints to the fact that he may have said something worse. I'm not going to repeat it. I'm sure you could fill it in with your own imagination. So the exact quote that is carved literally in stone at the museum may not be quite right, but I think it is, the G-rated version for certain places. But in the sentiment is still the same. You need to get up. You need to move. Follow me. Let's go.
And once they get into the woods, what are they facing there, and what makes the difference in their success?
That is easy to say. It's marksmanship. So when the Marines come in, let's say they go to Mare Island, or they go to Port Royal or Paris Island, they're taught one thing above all else, and that's marksmanship. And it saves the day. It actually saves a lot of lives. So once they get into the wheat and through the wheat field and into the woods, they can start taking cover and concealment. They're going to maneuver and fire. They're picking off the Germans at meters and meters, and I've had the number and I've lost it off.
I heard 700 to 800
Yeah,
meters.
thank you. And it is, the Germans are floored. They've never seen this before. The French didn't do this. The British couldn't do this. And now who are these Americans that are doing this? So you got to remember, a lot of these young recruits were coming fresh off the farm field. So if you put another rifle in their hand and give them the expertise to do it, they're really going to take it to them. Even the city kids, no disrespect to the city kids, I'm a small town gal myself, but they learned quickly that marksmanship is going to save their life, and it does. The Germans are floored. They are just, some of them are just standing there and watching, so they couldn't believe that this was happening.
And they talk about this arboreal hell, that they're in this thick woods that was a hunting preserve.
It was.
And they've got to move from end to end through it. And the Germans had been there for what, months, right?
They'd been there for quite a long time, long enough to get their positions well fixed and well defended. The Germans do the same thing again, throughout the trench warfare. As a matter of fact, the German trenches are actually better than the American trenches or the British trenches or the French, because the British and the French had the mind, don't make them comfortable, we don't want them to stay. You want them to get out and go over the top. The Germans actually use concrete bunkers, and they actually fortify their trenches. They're doing some of that same thing, not to the extent with concrete and stuff, but they're really defending their positions very, very well in the wood. Yeah, so it's thick woods. It is well thick. I'm only 5'5", and the best description is that you've got brambles and stuff that are about my height, so it makes it very hard to see until they're on top of you, until they're in front of you. It's not pretty. And then now add gas masks
Yeah, I was
to
going to say,
that.
how extensive was gas use?
Gas was extensively used, and we'll talk about one here in a minute. And they can't see, and then I'm sitting here and my glasses are fogging up, because I'm a little warm in the lights. But the same effect happens with the gas masks. And I'm sure those of you who've gone through gas training, it's not pleasant. When all that stuff gets in there and the moisture and everything, how do you see? Yeah, I don't know.
And it's summertime.
And it's summertime and it's hot. And I'll tell you, summertime in France is not pleasant.
How long was there sustained combat just to get through the woods?
So they're actually in the battle, the first part of that, for about 2 weeks, pretty well sustained. And it's not just the woods. There is the battle for Baresh, where the 6th Marines are really into it. And then they're having these little towns of Torcy and Lucy-le-Bocage and some action in open farm fields and stuff. So it's about 2 weeks, and then they pull the Marines back, and this is when the 7th Infantry comes in. And those poor Marine soldiers of the 7th Infantry are actually a lot of really green recruits, and they get thrown into the meat grinder, and the Germans chew them up. And it's then they realize, oh, we got to get the Marines back in there. And this is when the Marines come back in that last week and start to clean up. But the 7th, it really gets battered bad.
Was the turning point for the war the fact that the Marines not only held the line, but were able to take it to the Germans and punch through their lines for the first time?
Well, for the Marines, yes, at that point, but that's happening across the front where the Americans are. So this is a larger, the turning point really is the American engagement in the war and us being able to stop that forward progression towards Paris and to push them back. And the Germans finally realize, we're done. The Americans are in it now. They're staying. They are skilled. They're green, yes, but they know they're going to fight, and there's nothing we can do about it. We don't have the reserves that they do. And we didn't bring to bear everything that the American populace could bring to bear in the war. We hadn't been there as long as the French and the British. If we'd really gotten going, we'd have seen a juggernaut like we did in World War II, I'm pretty sure.
So the heroism, the individual heroism, continues now for, what, 2 or 3 weeks?
It does. It does.
Tell me about some of the others other than Gunny Daly.
Though I like to call it, where do we get such men? And I still say this today. Mike and I were talking earlier, and my brother's in the Army, we were talking about his generation. They are no different today than they were then, willing to go and do these things. One of them is Clifton Cates, and I'm pretty sure everybody knows who Cates is. He goes on to be Commandant of the Marine Corps. One of the interesting pieces about Cates is that he's with the 96 Company, and they're getting shelled pretty heavily. And I want to get this right, so I'm going to go back to my notes, so forgive me for cheating. He's a very lucky man. You see the helmet and the dent in it? That's his actual helmet. That helmet sits in the Commandant's mess, I think, now in the Pentagon. And the dent's there because he got hit in the head with a round, and it knocked him out. And he's out for a good 5 or 10 minutes. So he gets up and he's dazed and he tries to put his helmet on but because of the dent, he can't make it fit. So he could see in the distance his men are still engaging the enemy, so he tries to get to them. He's staggering like a drunk, and he's nearly fallen over a couple times just getting to them. And Sergeant Tom Orgo sees Cates, and he's reeling from the blow to his head. So he takes out his wine-filled canteen. The sergeant has a wine-filled canteen. Well, they're in France. What would you put in your canteen? And he runs over to Cates, and he takes it and starts pouring it over Cates' head, in which he writes, "Don't pour it on me. Give me a drink of it." Pretty sure I'd say the same thing. And again, as I said, Cates does stay in and becomes commandant after serving on EWO as the 4th Marine Division commander. So he's got a pretty illustrious career. Actually, one of the best collections of personal papers regarding World War I is Cates' collection at the Marine Corps Archives today.
And that's the insignia on the helmet.
Yeah, that's the 2nd Division.
Is that the Army or is that the Marines?
That's the Army. So the 2nd Division is an Army division, and that is their insignia, but the Marines adopt it. And based on and I haven't memorized all the colors, but based on the background, you can actually tell right down to the battalion what unit it is.
Tell me about some of the others.
So I like to talk about the guys that you don't know about. And this gentleman, Private John Beck Flocken. What a name. He enlists out of St. Louis. He wasn't originally from there, but he was a salesman living there, and he enlists. And he was probably enlisted by none other than Fred Stockham, who we'll talk about here in a minute. He's with the 2nd Battalion. He takes the fight to the city of Baresh, the town of Baresh, with the 2nd Battalion. He ends up getting the Navy Cross and Distinguished Service Cross for the same action, which doesn't happen today, but back then, if the Army gave you an award, the Navy had to give you an equal amount. So, make it fair. His Silver Star doesn't give me enough information, but what he gets the Navy Cross for, it says, despite being wounded twice in his leg, he continued to press on and put his men, how did he write that? I think I got that wrong. But basically, he continues to fight even though he's wounded severely. And that bottom piece is actually from the casualty list, and you can see that he gets wounded. It's a horrible picture, but he ends up getting pulled out of the fight and sent back home in October of that year.
You were telling me earlier, Paris Island came about because of World War I.
It did. So World War I actually sees a lot of the stuff that we know today. So Paris Island is in 1916. It's Port Royal initially, and it is Paris Island with 2 R's, although they dropped one of the R's thinking they had it spelt wrong. But actually it was 2 R's after a gentleman last name Paris. Now, the one thing that really comes out that you will remember today is Quantico. Quantico comes about because they need a major, large training base on the East Coast. We don't have Camp Lejeune yet. We don't have a Camp Pendleton. We have to have one, and that's what Quantico becomes. Quantico becomes the overseas depot. It becomes the place to train officers. And as a matter of fact, some of the Marines that go overseas actually leave out of the pier at Quantico, which is still there today. And they are currently refurbishing the one building that remains from that time period on Quantico. It was covered in asbestos. Apparently, they're remediating.
What are they going to make it?
It's still going to be a warehouse. They're just fixing it up and taking the asbestos out so it stops doing damage to the people who work in it.
You mentioned earlier Gunny Stockham.
Yeah, so we can't talk about the war and not talk about Stockham because you want to talk about selflessness? He embodies selflessness. Stockham enlists in 1903, serves for a little while, and it goes back to Newark, New Jersey as a fireman for a while. Talk about service. He comes back to the Marine Corps, ends up in the Philippines, China, Mare Island, Nicaragua. He's got experience. And then he becomes a recruiter in St. Louis. And he's sending all these young men off to war. And he says, nah, you know what, I need to be in on that. And he ends up getting transferred in September of 17 and going to the 96 Company, was 2-6. This I wanted to get right, so I wanted to read this to you. On the night of the 13th or 14th of June, 5 hours of heavy enemy artillery bombardment, shrapnel, and gas, the 96th Company suffered terribly. Practically all of the officers of the company were wounded or killed. Stockham carried wounded out of the gas-infected areas to the dressing station, back and forth. Got a gas mask on. One wounded man had his gas mask shot away, and without regard for his own safety, Stockham removed his own and placed it on the wounded man, even though his fellow Marines were screaming not to do this. He ignored them and said, do your job. He repeats his actions of going back and forth until he finally collapses from the gas, and he dies on the 22nd of June from that gas. He gave his life for so many Marines. He gets the Medal of Honor, but it's not right after the war, probably because so many of the officers were gone, wounded or killed, and didn't put the paperwork in. But the man he saved was a man by the name of Barack Mattingly, who was a very high politician in the St. Louis area, actually becomes part of the Republican National Committee in the national arena. He works with Cates in the 30s to lobby to get him the Medal of Honor. And that Medal of Honor now resides in St. Louis for people to see. Although he's buried in New Jersey, the medal is at least in St. Louis. Matter of fact, their VFW post is named after him, or is it the American Legion? But they hold him in very high regard, and he thought very much of St. Louis, and they thought very much of him. But if you want to talk about selflessness and others above self, Gunny Stockham is the guy to talk about.
And then when you were telling me about some of the people you're going to be talking about, I said, well, surely there's got to be a corpsman involved here. The Marines don't go anywhere without a corpsman.
The Marine Corps can't go anywhere without its chaplains, its corpsmen, or its dentists.
But yeah, this guy was a dentist.
This guy was a dental surgeon. So Weed and Osborne, and I wanted to talk about Navy, and I said, you know what, we got to talk about Weed and Osborne. What is a dentist doing on the front line? Well, he's doing what he can. He is a dental surgeon. He does have medical training. So he's out there doing what he can. So if you've heard the story of Donald Duncan, Captain Donald Duncan is killed, but he's one who is helping him. So to get this right, Captain Donald F. Duncan walked out of the woods, tapping his leg with his swagger stick. He'd been wounded. Suddenly there was an explosion and a heavy burst of machine gun fire. Captain Duncan sank to the ground. First Sergeant Joseph Sisler stopped to help the wounded officer, while another ran for help. He found U.S. dental surgeon Weed and Osborne and a hospital apprenticeman and brought them back from the heavy fire, all of them carrying Duncan. They moved him to a small clump of trees. All the time he was gasping, hit through the stomach. We no more laid them on the ground, and an 8-inch shell came in and killed them all but one Marine. That's what happened to Lloyd Williams. He'd been wounded, been moved back, and a lucky shell came in and hit him and killed him. They were bombarding these men day in and day out. They couldn't get away from it, even in the rear with the dressing stations.
And going back to Gunny, Dan Daly, who wasn't about to live forever, he's in the thick of it for those next 3 or 4 weeks.
He is.
Some of his exploits after getting across the wheat field?
Are amazing. So there's one story of him driving a truck back and forth down Gobbs Gully, back and forth, and it's the only position that's not in direct line of the artillery, so he's shuttling supplies back and forth. There is rumor that he may have bent his elbow a little bit to give him some liquid courage to do this. He's a good Irishman after all. But this is not just what he's doing. He's also taking the enemy to the fight. He's taking it to them. He's engaging his Marines. And some of the positions, some of the actions that he takes, he actually gets recommended for a 3rd Medal of Honor.
Yeah, now, he had already gotten 1 Medal of Honor in Haiti and 1 in China before he even goes to France. And there's a bit of a controversy why he didn't get the 3rd.
Pershing is in charge. He has final decision on all awards. And when the Medal of Honor recommendation went up for Dan Daly, the story is that Pershing said, no man needs a 3rd Medal of Honor, and strikes it down. I do know that I've seen the records where he's actually struck down many, many Medal of Honor recommendations, one including for Cates, where he said no. And that's where Cates ends up with Navy Cross instead. It's an old rivalry that starts from way back between the Army and the Marine Corps.
There's another quote that's kind of bandied about, and we're not sure of its veracity, but that Pershing finally got it when it came to the Marines. Let's talk about that quote.
So the quote is that, I always screw the quote up, but it is to the effect that the best thing in the war was the Marine and his rifle, his marksmanship. I don't necessarily believe that. I have yet to find actual definitive proof that he said that, and I don't know that I would necessarily believe that he said it because of his, animosity is a strong word, but his disdain for the Marines to some degree. Matter of fact, he was offered a 2nd Brigade to form a full division of Marines, and he said, no, I don't want it. And he relegated him to the service of supply. So I don't know that I necessarily believe that.
The other thing the Marines had going for them was they had an embedded reporter with them.
They did. So as you well know what it is to be embedded with the Marines, sometimes your stories get away from you. But Floyd Gibbons from the Chicago Tribune is with the Marines, and Gibbons is taking notes and writing stories, but the censors will crop out any mention of units. So it's just Americans. Well, in the middle of it, Gibbons is hit. They think he's dead. Well, the censors think he's dead. They don't know that he's been severely wounded, but he's still alive. So they let his last story go. Well, he'd been embedded with the Marines. He had a little bit of the Kool-Aid, and he believed, they were the best in the world. I think he was right, but that's my opinion. And they let it go through, and this is where you get the story in the Chicago Tribune that the Marines have won the day at Belleau Wood, and it has saved Paris, and there was no other force in the world there except the Marines, which, of course, makes the Army very, very upset.
Ballistic.
He probably was. I'm sure he had a few choice words.
Yeah, and I've seen some of those headlines. The whole front page of the Chicago Tribune, it's just all the Marines.
It is.
They're the only ones who are fighting in France.
It is.
It's all the
There's
Marine
no
Corps.
context to it to understand that the Marines are a portion of this larger force that was in Chateau Thierry campaign.
And that kind of gets to the rivalry that the Army and the Marines have always had about, they've always accused us of having better PR people.
We did. There was a publicity bureau created. It was in New York City, and it was rampant and rabid with its ability to get the word out. It would tell stories all over the place.
So let's talk now about the legacy of Belleau Wood. We know how it really changed the direction of the war in 1918. How did it change the Marine Corps?
Well, one of the ways, and one more person I want to talk about is this.
Sorry.
Nope, this goes in perfectly. So not everybody so there's this mass demobilization after the war, and a lot of people just scatter to the winds. But those who stay really, really have an impact on the Marine Corps. And there's this gentleman here, John Fay. Fay enlists in 1899, and he rises pretty far up the enlisted ranks, and I believe he's a first sergeant by the time he's commissioned in October of 17. He leads the Marines through the battles through the whole war. Now, he could have retired after the war. He would have had plenty of service time. But he stays in. And he takes his experience and he goes to Haiti and Nicaragua, where they're in combat again. He's teaching Marines what he's learned, and he's passing it on. And I think Colonel Mahar would agree, and all the others. That's what you do. That's what you're for, is to teach them what you've learned and your experiences. He retires in 1932 and then dies 7 years later, but he's highly decorated. Look at the Distinguished Service Cross, Navy Cross for the same action, and the Silver Star for just Belleau Wood alone. He goes on to get the French Croix de Guerre twice and another Silver Star at Blancmont. I mean, there's no denying that he knew what he was doing, and he was going to take that and teach the rest of the Marines in the 20s and the 30s.
Organizationally, what did the Marine Corps look like going into World War I and then coming out of World War I?
So leading up to World War I, in 1914, we actually start to see permanent regiments. Before that, we didn't have permanent regiments. What you would form, you would pull a little bit from a garrison, you would pull some from a barracks, you'd pull some from a ship, and you'd form up a provisional unit. Sometimes enough to provisional brigade. They would go do the mission, and they'd come back and then scatter back to the winds. We didn't have that. 1914, you start seeing the advanced base force concept come about, 1st and 2nd regiments there. Then we get the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th. This sets the stage for the Marine Corps. This is going to show us we can sustain permanent forces. We don't need to be relegated to this backwater duty. We can be in the fight just like anybody else, and it sticks. And they keep working this through the 20s and the 30s, and then they start on taking on the amphibious doctrine to really hold things down. But it really, and then you have the permanent bases. Quantico's there to stay. Parris Island is there to stay. And things start to grow from there. And the prestige of the general officer. So Lejeune comes in, he's really going to hit it hard. The Marine Corps needs to stay.
Were the Marines treated more as equals now by the War Department after what they did in World War I, or is it still,
It's
did they have to
still,
fight for their turf?
they still had to fight for their turf. You still have the sort of a big brother kind of attitude, oh, you're very nice. You know, the Army's still going to have that. The Army's going to have that throughout, you know, World War II, even that rivalry is going to stay. I mean, it leads to the Unification Act in 1947, so we're still dealing with it in the late 40s. It is on equal footing with the Navy. The Navy actually starts to understand it a little bit better and treat us a little bit better within the Navy department. It's still tenuous, but it has a better reputation. It is more on solid footing.
Annette, the sacrifices were made by the Marines up to that time. How did they equate with all the wars the Marines had fought in up to that time?
So Belleau Wood is the bloodiest battle up to that point. It has more casualties than any other battle, any other war combined to that date. But Belleau Wood is not the bloodiest of World War I, as one of its myths. Blancmont and Soissons, for their time period, or 2 days, 1 day. Belleau Wood's 3 weeks. Blancmont and Soissons are much worse. But the Marines could take the fight to the Germans. This is the story that is Belleau. This is the story that is Belleau Wood, that is World War I. The tenacity, the unwillingness to quit. The mission is at hand. We need to achieve it. And, you know, we take a beating in Belleau Wood. We take a beating in World War I, period.
Annette, is it just my age, or was it the heat in Quantico 50 years ago that I remember Belleau Wood, I remember the history lesson, but it didn't really stick, and it's now coming to fore, you know, 50 years later, and I see it with the new Corps, that they seem to accept Belleau Wood really even more so than the Chosin Reservoir, Guadalcanal. Is that just me, or is there a real resurrection of Belleau Wood as being one of the most seminal events in the Marine Corps history?
I think you're seeing a resurrection of it because we fast approached the centennial. But I think because when General Krulak came in as commandant, he had a real eye for what World War I meant and what particularly Belleau Wood meant. And that's where you see the annual trek back to Belleau Wood during the Memorial Day ceremonies at the Ain-Marne Cemetery. And that push to really get that back into the history of the Marine Corps, and that it has this lasting impact on the Corps. So, you know, this is where you're seeing it, and now it's even more ramped up when, the colonel and the regiments are going over, and they have this chance to go and visit and see, and, I think it means more to them than it ever has.
I just got an email from a Marine I was embedded with, and he was being deployed over to AFRICOM, and they were going through Europe. And he said, we went to Belleau Wood. We took a few days off, and we went to Belleau Wood. And there was so much, it was almost like going to Mecca for them.
It is, and I think that, Belleau Wood is that holy ground. And as a matter of fact, if you go there today, it looks very much like it did then. It has not changed. There are not these big monuments like Gettysburg. The ground is not manicured with an inch of its life outside of the cemetery. It is still farms, and a lot of times those farms are still owned by the same families. And their wheat field is still there. The wood is still there. And you could go into it. Now, time has softened some of those impact craters and those trenches, but they're still there. And yes, there's still unexploded ordnance there, and the French are still dealing with it. But you can go to a place that looks very much like it did then, and it will raise the hair on the back of your neck, and realizing this is what they were seeing. This is what they were dealing with. I wanted to give you the price of the butcher's bill, so to speak, for Belleau Wood. The casualty figures for Belleau Wood are all over the place, even in official sources, because of the nature of the war and the fact that so many officers were casualties themselves. Some of the legacy, 4 future commandants fought in the battle. Just for grins and giggles, I picked the battle for World War II, and look at the numbers of the senior leadership for Iwo Jima alone, all Belleau Wood veterans. But Belleau Wood today, there's the hunting lodge. And these are my photographs. I went about 4 years ago. That's the hunting lodge. And I was there with the 6th Marines, and we walked out into the wood, and there was a major standing there, and I said, "Hey, Major, look, there's a hole. Go get in it." He did. His wife made him do it. And you could see him in the background, the hill and valleys of where these holes are. At the Einmarn Cemetery, they take very good care of our Marines. They take very, very good care of our Marines. I've seen them out there with scissors going around the headstones. These are French native, people who live there. One other is the monument that sits outside of Chateau Thierry, which is just been refurbished, and they welcome you to come, and they will welcome you with open arms, and they will say thank you. And when they said that to me, I said, think of it as a thank you for the revolution. If you want to thank me for World War II, that's one thing, but we were just paying your kindness back for helping us in the revolution.
World War I can get a little bit arcane, but you bring it to life with the characters and the history. Like I said, it's cleared up a lot of questions that I've had.
Well, for me, I was telling Mike on the phone, I said, look, I tell stories about individual Marines because the word corps in Latin comes from corpse, body. You cannot have a Marine Corps without individuals. You cannot do what the Marine Corps does without those individuals. So we must remember their actions and their service, whether it was at Belleau Wood, or it was Vietnam, or it was Iraq. You have to remember their service, and that's all I'm doing is remembering their service.
But I would be remiss.
They're going to run me out with torches and pitchforks, I know it.
She was afraid she'd get run out of town, but I said we're going to debunk and clarify a couple of major myths.
Yes.
So let's go for the big one now. Let's wrap it up with devil dogs.
Okay, so the story is that Teufelhunden is the German word that they dubbed the Marines, devil dogs, because of Belleau Wood. First part of that is that Teufelhunden is not a real German word. Let that sink in for a second. And so you've all seen the recruiting poster of the bulldog chasing the dachshund, right? And it says Teufelhunden on it. That came out in the spring of 18 before Belleau Wood, and it was put out by the Publicity Bureau. There are newspaper accounts of the word Teufelhunden from as far as Ogden, Utah to Minneapolis before Belleau Wood. So I'm not too sure who came up with it, but I'm pretty sure it was a person who didn't speak German. And probably an American. We don't actively debunk those myths. They serve a purpose. They build esprit. They give you that cohesiveness that you need to make the Marines do something that's not natural. It is unnatural to go to the sound of the gunfire. It is unnatural to go towards the battle. But because they have that esprit and they have that understanding that the Marine to the right, the Marine to the left, has that same training and that same understanding that they can get through it. So it serves a purpose.
What the hell? Who wants to live forever? Here's a great question. What was the relationship like between General Lejeune and General Pershing?
Well, so General Lejeune's not actually at Belleau Wood. He doesn't get into it. He's in France, but he's not engaged in it yet. He's actually lobbying Pershing for a job up through that time. But their relationship is actually fairly decent. There's really no animosity because, of course, Lejeune has been trained at Army schools as well through his career, and he served with the Army before. So it's actually a pretty decent relationship. I mean, I wouldn't say they were best buds out having drinks every night, but they were certainly cordial to one another and understood each other as professionals.
You mentioned earlier, and this question's about that, about the experience the Marines had going into France, you know, in Haiti and China and whatever. You know, the tactics at the time were really back to Civil War tactics.
They were. So, yeah, going across that wheat field, you're moving in a line, just like you would across an open field at Gettysburg, doing the same tactic, but against much larger caliber weapons and much more accurate and much more rapid fire. So, yeah, it was pretty rudimentary in comparison.
The question also goes on to talk about General Pershing and the Army had a fair amount of experience in the Philippines and Spanish-American War and some of the others, and but the scale of the Army was so small, it was not really a factor, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, think about where Pershing had been the years before. He'd been riding around down Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. How did that work out for him? He didn't catch him. But he did have experience. No disrespect intended, but he did have the experience. But a lot of the officers did not.
Now, also, one of the heads, I can't remember which Marine regiment it was, but it was a brigade. It was headed by an Army officer who...
That was the 4th Brigade.
The 4th Brigade.
Yeah.
And quite astonishing, and that the Marines loved him, and he loved them.
He loved them so much, he put the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor in his own helmet.
Okay.
He did.
And I must say, these questions came from one of our Army brethren here tonight, and we thank you for your service, and we hope you accept our little rivalry here in good spirit, but you bring out some good points about what the Army was all about and what Pershing...
Well, to tack onto that, let me just repeat that at Belleau Wood, it was not a complete Marine show. The Marines get the headlines, but the Army was there, and in large numbers. In fact, the second engineers were toe-to-toe with the Marines, and when it came down to it, at Lemaire Farms with Lem Shepard, they're digging in with their helmets, because they don't even have their own shovels. They're digging in with their helmets, trying to get cover, and before the Germans start to engage them, they're right there with them. And take some serious heavy losses. And like I said, the 3rd Brigade's engaged as well. So don't think that Belleau Wood is... Don't let me misrepresent Belleau Wood as a completely only Marine show. The Army is there, and they go toe-to-toe, and they take the beating too. It's just that it means so much more to the Marine Corps as opposed to the way it does for the Army.
Another question, did the Marine Corps have to draft up for World War I?
It did. So the draft actually takes place, starts in World War I. We draft all the way up through Vietnam.
And to get to that 10,000 to 50,000?
Yeah, we had to get them somewhere.
And even though the rest of the country really wasn't anxious to go to war, Woodrow Wilson dragged their feet. He didn't have his Secretary of Defense, had no military experience at all. I mean, he really didn't think much of the military at all.
No.
And then it was game on, and in a period of a year, we were able to raise a 1 million-man army and get them over there.
Well, I think part for the Marine Corps, I think the person who's overlooked in this is actually Major General Barnett, the Major General Commandant. He sees it coming, he knows it's coming, and he's the one who actually starts the pace, starts the process of bringing these men back so that they can actually form up these regiments. He's got the vision. He knows we need training bases. He starts acquiring these locations at Quantico, at Parris Island. He's got the vision. He's overlooked. He's overshadowed by his predecessors. Or successor, excuse me.
Annette Amerman, thank you for bringing us all up to speed, clarifying some of the things we thought we knew, now we know better, and really giving us that real portrait of sacrifice, service, and selflessness that we all wonder where it came from, and I think we all have a better idea where it came from in the woods in France.
Well, thank you, Mike, and I appreciate it. It's good to talk to you tonight. Good questions.
Thanks again to Synchrony Financial for making this effort possible and supporting us. But to both of you, what a professional presentation. Again, thank you very much. He'll be around for a couple of minutes here if you've got any final questions. Thanks again for all of you for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thank you.
Great story.
That was fun.